Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr. is a decorated P-51 combat pilot and served as one of the original Tuskegee Airmen during World War II. He discovered his passion for aviation at an early age when he saw Charles Lindbergh's donation of the Spirit of St. Louis to the Smithsonian. From that point on, he knew he wanted to fly. After graduating from Springfield College in 1943, he turned down an infantry commission and enlisted as an aviation cadet as part of the Tuskegee experiment. Despite tremendous racial barriers, he graduated from Tuskegee, completed combat training, and joined the 100th Fighter Squadron 332nd Fighter Group in the European Theater in August of 1944. Tuskegee Airmen of the 100th Fighter Squadron escorted 15th and 8th Air Force bombers throughout the winter of 1944-45, all the way to Berlin when a second fighter group failed a rendezvous. This mission earned the Presidential Unit Citation as the longest escort mission of the war. During the escort, Messerschmitt 262S rose to defend Berlin, and in the melee that followed, Captain Brown became one of the 3 15th Air Force pilots to down a jet that day. After starting another aerial engagement, he realized his fuel state was below half. He broke off the attack and flew home 700 miles over enemy territory. After landing, his P-51 shut down due to fuel starvation while still on the runway. A few days later, he added a Focke-Wulf 190 to his tally. After victory in Europe, Captain Brown took command of the 100th Fighter Squadron and commanded the unit until its deactivation in October 1945. For his achievements in combat, Captain Brown was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal with 8 oak leaf clusters. Due to the tenacity and courage of Captain Brown and others like him, the United States military was officially desegregated by President Truman in 1948 at a ceremony in the Capitol Rotunda on March 29, 2000. President George W. Bush awarded the Tuskegee Airmen the Congressional Gold Medal and offered words of atonement for the racial injustices the Tuskegee Airmen suffered while serving their country so valiantly. Captain Roscoe C. Brown, along with 5 other airmen, accepted the medal from the President on the behalf of all of them.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is our distinct pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Roscoe Brown, interviewed by Major Becky Russo.
All right. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, good morning.
Good sunny morning.
Let me just say one more time, thank you so much for being with us this week.
It's my privilege.
As many of you may or may not know, Dr. Brown has actually been an Eagle twice before, 2004 and 2008. And the GOE team was so inspired and excited about your story that we thought we had to bring you back for the hat trick. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for thinking about me.
So with that, let's get started. Start off with telling us about how you got interested in aviation.
As you saw in the video, I first got inspired by Charles A. Lindbergh. In 1927, he flew nonstop 33 and a half hours from Roosevelt Field in New York City to Liberator Airport in Paris. This was the first nonstop flight across the ocean. Recall that the Wright brothers started flying in 1903. So therefore, 1927 was only 24 years after aviation began. That's like something happening in 1990 that we're talking about now. So that shows the compression of the time. But because of the sensationalism of Lindbergh's exploits, the newspapers carried major headlines. They actually got his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, to be donated to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. I grew up in Washington, D.C. when it was a segregated city. African Americans were about a third of the population. The population of the country was about 130 million, and about 13 million African Americans. But Washington, D.C. was an interesting example of what segregation can do and how paradoxical segregation is. For example, the transportation, the rail transportation, streetcars were integrated. The federal buildings, except for lunch counters, were integrated. The schools, however, were segregated. But because it was Washington, D.C., and a large number of middle-class African Americans who worked for the government, the school systems were really pretty much equal. I went to Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C., which is known as the most famous segregated high school in history, because it developed the first black federal judge. It developed Dr. Charles Drew, who developed the blood bank. It developed the first black federal judge, William Hastie, who was instrumental in helping to start the Tuskegee Airmen. So I had a good background. And on Sundays, my parents would take me and my sister to the Corcoran Art Gallery, to the Lincoln Memorial, to the Washington Monument, and to the Smithsonian. So one day in April of 1928, they took me to the Smithsonian, and in the ceiling was the Spirit of St. Louis. That caught my attention, particularly after the press had written about it. Lindbergh wrote a book called We, describing his trip. It's interesting to note that things that happened then, we wouldn't even think about doing now. One of the things he tells in the book, when he got close to the shore of Europe, he didn't know exactly where to head, because he was doing this by compass and by stars. So he flew down to about 50 feet, and he yelled at the fisherman, "Which way is London?" And the fisherman pointed this way, and he turned, and he landed perfectly. You couldn't beat that. And that's the reason why aviation really caught the attention of everybody. African Americans didn't have the opportunities that white Americans had because of racial segregation. Much of the flying was in the South. In fact, my first airplane ride was at Washington Airport, which is now Reagan, but it was a small airport. It was in Virginia. It was segregated, and they would not allow blacks to go up even as passengers. But my father, who was in Roosevelt's administration in charge of health for blacks in America, was very light-skinned. So he told the ticket agent that he wanted to take these two children of French West African nationals who the State Department had invited up in the air. So I got a chance. He said, "Don't speak French, keep your mouth shut until you get in the air." And I had a 30-minute ride, and that really sealed it. I wanted to fly. African Americans had been denigrated by a study in 1925 by the War Department that said that African Americans didn't have the intelligence, the leadership ability, or the coordination to fly airplanes. And as a result, there were no African Americans accepted into Air Force training. However, by the time World War II got started, they began to have the civilian pilot training program, CPT, that somebody talked about yesterday, and they had pilot training programs at Tuskegee, right down the road, at Hampton University, at West Virginia State University, and at Howard University. So there'd been about 120 black civilian pilots trained. So that at the beginning of World War II, or just before it, Franklin Roosevelt was running for his third term in 1940, and his opponent was Wendell Willkie, who developed the one world concept and was attracting many liberal people. African Americans had voted Republican since the days of Lincoln until the Depression, when they finally elected and voted overwhelmingly for Roosevelt because of his programs. So the Roosevelt administration needed the African American vote. But the NAACP and the Pullman Car Porters Union, which was the largest organized union of blacks, put pressure on Roosevelt to appoint a black general and to establish a pursuit squadron or a flying training program for African Americans so that we could be in the top branch of the service. You notice I said the Air Force was the top branch of the service. Let's hear it for the Air Force. All right. Well, that's the way it was, because flying was so important. The Air Force, after World War I, Rickenbacker and so on, was so glamorous that everybody wanted to be a pilot. So as a result of this pressure, the Pullman Car Porters Union and NAACP said, we're going to march on Washington. This was many years before King's March in 1963. We're going to march on Washington to make sure that the world knows that this country is segregating blacks. As a result of that, President Roosevelt created by executive order a black pursuit squadron, which would be trained to be fighter pilots, but it would be trained in segregation, in segregated circumstances. He also appointed the first black general, General Benjamin O. Davis Sr., who actually was the father of the person who became our commander, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr. So as a result of this, they selected Tuskegee Institute, Tuskegee, Alabama, as a site for the Air Force, for the training. You say, well, why didn't they put the blacks in various training spots at Randolph and others in the South? But because of the rampant segregation, they knew we wouldn't be treated fairly, and Tuskegee had a history with its civilian child training program and its work with George Washington Carver, who developed the peanut and the peanut industry, to have technology that could help to support Air Force training. So as a result, they created an air base 6 miles from Tuskegee called Moton Field. Moton Field still exists. It is now a National Historic Site with the original hangars that we trained out of open every day to the public. It's something that anyone should see. Has anyone here been to Moton Field? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You got to do better than that. I think I didn't count right. It must have been at least 25 of you. But Moton Field is a place where you really ought to go because you get the feeling. You see the PT-17s that we trained in. You can almost get in them and fly them. So Moton Field was where our initial training was. Our basic training was at an air base. Again, the paradox of segregation. The government spent over $1 million to develop a separate air base to train African Americans, Tuskegee Army Air Base, which was about 9 miles from the Tuskegee city. Actually, that base was closed down. It was sold. They were trying to make a supermarket out of some of it. But it was a great air base. It had great runways, had facilities, officers club. They had maintenance facilities. It was a first-class air base. One thing that you must say, that even though there was resistance to our becoming pilots, once that resistance was overcome by Roosevelt, they went out of their way to develop good facilities. The problem, however, is that you can't change people's minds with just facilities, with bricks and mortar. So the first commander of our training was a very prejudiced person who insisted that the white instructor pilots stay from the black instructor pilots, that blacks couldn't go into the officers club. But fortunately, because of protests, particularly in the black press, he was removed and was replaced by a person who's now legendary, Colonel, now General Noel Parrish, who was from the South, He'd gone to Rice University. He knew that scientifically there was no reason why African Americans couldn't do as good as whites in terms of learning to fly. And he took down the black and white signs, the colored and white signs. He said the officers' club should be integrated. And he said, we know you can do it. And that's one of the things that you're learning in your training now. When you decide you can do something and you have the confidence to do it, you will do it. You may trip here and there, but you will do it. That's one of the things that I really admire about the program that you're in. In terms of the people who were selected to be trainees as pilots, they went to the colleges, to the black colleges and the white colleges, because at that time you required 2 years of college to become an aviation cadet, and they sold us on the idea of being a pilot. They didn't have to do much selling, because African Americans had always wanted to fly. Actually, one of the first cross-country flights was done by an African-American duo, Alfred Anderson, who later became the chief instructor pilot at Tuskegee, and Dr. Alfred Forsyth, who flew across the country, landing at various airports, the first cross-country flight that African Americans had taken. So there's a lot of history that we knew about, because unlike today, the black press had over 400 newspapers, and that was a major way of communicating to the 13 million blacks who lived in this country at that time. So they went to the colleges. In my case, I was a junior. I'd already earned a commission as a second lieutenant from the civilian military training program in the infantry, but I wanted to fly. So when the opportunity came, they called me to active duty as an infantry officer. I said, no, that's not going to work. So I resigned my commission and signed up to be an aviation cadet. And on the day I graduated, the next year, 1943, as the valedictorian of my class at Springfield College, which was a home of basketball and sports medicine and volleyball, I left to go to Tuskegee. And again, segregation takes over. You could ride the trains to Washington, D.C. as an integrated passenger, but in Washington, D.C., you had to get off and go to a car that was reserved only for blacks, which was located right behind the locomotive. One of the negative factors of segregation. However, we were not going to be deterred. We had great primary training. Our primary instructors were African Americans who had learned to fly either on their own or through the civilian pilot training program. Our basic training was done by white flying officers who volunteered to come to Tuskegee and to teach us, and our advanced program was done likewise. In the primary program, we flew the Stearman PT-17, where you really got the experience of flying. This is where you could see the scarf flying in the air, you could feel the wind blowing over your face, you could turn it upside down and you could feel that you were getting those G-forces, and that's what really got us totally excited about flying. After primary training, which was in Moulton Field, we went to Tuskegee Army Air Base, where we flew the BT-13 for basic training, a low-wing plane with fixed landing gear, not much fun to fly. And then finally, as someone said yesterday, the AT-6. AT-6 still flies around. It's a great airplane, and it had a retractable landing gear, and it gave you some of the feelings of being a fighter pilot. When I graduated in March of 1944, I then took 10 hours of transition training in the P-40 at Tuskegee Army Air Base. The P-40 was a difficult plane to fly, a narrow landing gear, not much power. But fortunately, when I went to transition training, we were assigned to go to Selfridge Field in Michigan, but they'd had a race ride in Detroit, in 1943 and 1944, and they said, we don't want these troublemaking African Americans to come to Detroit. So at midnight, one day in May, they put us on a train to nowhere, but nowhere ended up to be Walterboro, South Carolina. Again, they had an air base where African Americans were going to be trained, and they were supposed to be trained in equal circumstances. But the second night when we got there, when we went to the theater, we found they had a sign that said, blacks over here, whites over here. And we said, we're going to fight for democracy, and you want us to sit in segregated circumstances? So again, using the example that many of you are learning here, we took the leadership role and sat in the first row of the white section. The commander then came and said, well, you can't sit here. And he said, you boys, we said, we are officers, we are men. You can't sit here. And if you come back and sit here again, we are going to court-martial you. We said to him, they spent $75,000 training us, and if President Roosevelt hears that you're court-martialing us for establishing our rights as first-class citizens, which we're fighting for, you won't have a job. So the next night when we came back, the signs were removed. We had integrated the theater by positive, direct action. That's one of the things that you always learn when you're fighting injustice. And obviously, racism and segregation represents the epitome of injustice. So at Walterboro, we flew the P-47 Thunderbird, a big radial engine, large wingspan, great power, but not much turning radius because it was so heavy. But we learned some really interesting tactics in our combat training. The Marines had a base near Charleston, South Carolina, Walterboro being near Columbia, South Carolina. And when we went up to fly our combat training mission, sometime we would meet the Corsairs who were doing likewise. So we then jump the Corsairs, they jump us, and we get into a Loughborough circle, moving around. But because the P-47 rather had such inertia, it would go out. It wouldn't stay tight on the wing, on the tail of the plane you're trying to get. So we learned a technique, which many of you who've flown know, that as you pull tight and you begin to stall out, you bump the stick and then give it some power. Bring it back, pull it tight, dump the stick, give it some power. And that developed some skills in us that we use later in combat. And I'll ask Becky if she wants to know about our combat experience. Yeah.
I would love to.
Well,
I'll be here all day.
See, we have to realize that she's here as well. We're part of a team here.
You're doing great. You don't need me.
I do need you. Oh boy, this is fun. So in combat, let me give some statistics. In this whole experience, 3,000 young men, at that time it was only men, were trained at Tuskegee. Over the 4 years of the training span, 1,000 pilots were graduated. 660 were fighter pilots, and the other 300 were bomber pilots because they started a bomb group, the 477th, again over protest because originally the reason why the racists wanted a fighter group is only one pilot and he didn't have to interact with white enlisted men. So as a result of the pressure, they decided to start a bomb group. But the war ended before they could get into combat. But of the 650 who graduated as fighter pilots, about 360 actually ended overseas. Of those 360 who ended overseas, about 60 of them were killed in action, and 96 won distinguished units, distinguished flying crosses, and we got about 700 air medals. So once we got there, we did the job. But getting there was a problem, because no one wanted the first group of pilots, which was one squadron, the 99th, to be attached to them. And finally, as a result of the pressure of the black press, they sent them, the 99th alone, to North Africa. They attached them to a white fighter group headed by a man by the name of Colonel Momeyer, who said, I don't want any colored people flying with me, but you sign them. So when the first briefing was held, when they go on a ground support mission, he gave them a 6:15 call when the actual briefing was a 6. So when the black pilots ended up there, led by Colonel Davis, he said, why are you boys late? He said, well, that's the time you gave us. He said, well, I tell you what, the briefing is, you all get up there and just follow me. So with no actual briefing, the Tuskegee Airmen, the 99, had to learn their combat maneuvers on their own. And eventually they did some ground support and some strafing. And finally, after they'd been over there about 3 or 4 months, they shot down their first plane. But by that time, 3 more squadrons had been formed, the 100th, the 301st, and the 302nd, into what is known as the 332nd Fighter Group, later known as the Red Tails. So when the 332nd went overseas, they went to Naples, and they flew harbor patrol. And finally, again, because of the protests of the black press and those in the military, they decided to assign us to the 15th Air Force. The 15th Air Force was located in southern Italy and was a strategic Air Force coming out of Italy with the long-range bombers, just as the 8th Air Force coming out of England with its long-range bombers. So as a result of being assigned to the 15th Air Force, we began to do fighter escort. Our first fighter escort missions were in the P-47, but fortunately, within about 2 weeks, we were replaced by the great P-51. And so when I went overseas as a replacement pilot in August, the group had been flying P-51s for about 2 months. I had transitioned into a P-47, but when I got overseas, they had P-51s and said, look, you got to learn how to do this real fast. So after 4 flights in the P-51, I did my first combat mission on an escort on August 21st, going to Ploesti. One of Jim, I think, went to Ploesti a lot of times. So I went there a couple of times, and it was quite a mess because we didn't have enough air power to really protect the bombers as they should. But as a result of that work, I learned some skills that I really needed to know. One of the skills is to be able to space yourself appropriately with your wingman so that you can look over your shoulder and the people on the other side can look over their shoulder to make sure that we are covered. We flew about maybe 100 feet above the bombers, and we flew in a weave. We had 8 planes on one side, 8 planes on the other side, and we flew in a weave, coming back and forth. That was beautiful. That was really beautiful. The thing that happened, however, is because we stayed so close to the bombers and protected them, we were not shooting down any planes. And someone said the 99th and 332nd really is not aggressive enough. So they called our commander, Benjamin Davis Jr., to Washington to testify before one of the Armed Forces Committees, and he explained that we were doing this close support work, that we hadn't been given good briefings, but we were protecting the bombers. Turns out that the day he did the testimony, we did shoot down 13 planes that had jumped us on a strafing mission. So that ended that lie that said that we didn't shoot down planes. So for the rest of the war, we flew bomber escort, we flew strafing missions, we flew some bombing missions, and we protected the bombers. We didn't shoot down as many planes as some of the other groups, but we didn't lose as many planes as some of the other groups. And that's why when you see the movie Red Tails, you see the white pilots saying, we want the Red Tails to be our escort, because they could see us. We had shiny P-51s with shiny red tails. They could see us, and you could look around. It's like being protected. It's like going into an airport and see the security. You know you're safe, at least until they did the study the other day. So they could look around and say, they're the Red Tails. So as a result of that, we did a really good job. We shot down a few planes. We had some episodes that hinge on race. You saw in the movie Red Tails how some of the pilots, white pilots, didn't want to recognize us. But on one mission in December of 1944, the B-17 got bogged in and had to land at our airport and couldn't take off. So we invited them in, the crew, in to stay with us in our tents. And one of the men said, I'm not going to sleep with any black folks. I'm going to stay in this airplane. So he stayed in the airplane until about 2 o'clock in the morning, when it got to be about 10 degrees below. 2 o'clock in the morning, knock, knock, can I come in? He said, it's too cold out there. As a result of that, he stayed with us, and they had a good experience. But one of the pilots said, in writing to his wife, that our censor was looking at the letter, said, I have been spending the past 2 nights sleeping with black folks, eating black folks' food, although they didn't use that word, and I hope you take me back. We were really disappointed by that. But on the other hand, the letter never got sent because the censor tore it up. Because you wouldn't want to spew that kind of racist drivel anywhere. But overall, as the war went on and our reputation increased, pilots would come up to us and say, look, I was on this mission. You heard it today, the other day. I was on this mission. The Red Tails protected me. We didn't shoot down a lot of planes, but we did protect the bombers. And finally, on March 24th, 1945, we had an opportunity to escort bombers on the longest mission of the 15th Air Force